So we all know everything there is to know about ferries now.
And if you missed last month's episode, you need to go and listen and watch it because it's really good, all about ferries.
It's really good. And this month, it's sort of part 2. It's all about Freeports. And we've got the same guests. We've got Mike Robertson and Geordie Sandison from Yes Orkney and Prof Alf Baird.
At the back of my head, I just have an ongoing assumption that Freeports are really not a very good idea from the point of view of helping the local economy. But then I read things and that, and it says the opposite. So I just don't know. My suspicion is that they're good if you want to evade taxes or if you're a pirate. But that's very ill-informed. So I'm hoping by the end of this programme that to be much better informed.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's find out what everybody else thinks. And we're going to start with John Swinney, who sets out why the Scottish Government decided to go ahead with, Greenports, they're calling them, and we'll get underneath that a little bit as we go along. Then we've got Alf telling us his perspective, and we also have Craig DL from Part of a Conversation, which is another one of our podcasts, and we'll give you the link to that in the notes.
When the Minister for Business, Trade, Enterprise and Tourism announced our cooperation with the UK Government on Green Freeports to Parliament last February, he explained how we had negotiated a distinctively Scottish approach, bringing our own Green Freeports model to modify the English Freeports approach to suit Scotland's needs and priorities. In particular, he emphasised how the approach would give top priority to regeneration and high-quality job creation, would support our journey to net zero, and would embed our Fair Work agenda at its very heart. The competition we launched jointly last March on the basis of a detailed prospectus embodied that approach, and the outcome of the competition amply justified it. Taken together, the 2 winning bids from the Firth of Forth and Inverness and Cromarty Firth aspired to create 75,000 new, high-skilled, well-paid jobs, to bring forward nearly £11 billion in private and public investment, to deliver a significant enhancement of our offshore wind manufacturing capacity, to advance alternative fuel production, including green hydrogen, and to promote innovation and trade across multiple sectors.
What's a Freeport? Why are they meant to be a good thing?
My PhD is in container shipping, so I studied container ports around the world, and quite a lot of them were Freeports, and particularly transshipment ports. So that's ports that bring cargo in, they add value to it, and then they re-export it. It's not cargo for the domestic market. Take Singapore as an example. Singapore is a Freeport as well, or in Malaysia, some ports next to it. Goods come in from multinational companies. They're stored in the port. They maybe add value to them, packaging, reprocessing, and then they re-export to another country. So it's not; these are not goods for Singapore necessarily. They're goods for somewhere else. The goods come in tax-free. There's tax allowances for the investment there, and then they re-export the goods. The benefit you get for the port is the port grows its volume, its traffic. So it gives the national economy connectivity to global markets, so it can boost its own national economy. Forth ports don't need this model because we're not a transshipment port on the Forth or in Cromarty.
Yeah.
They're not transshipping. They're not bringing goods in from, say, Asia and then distributing them to the Baltic countries, for example. That would be transshipment. This Freeport idea, or green Freeports, is not about growing trade necessarily. I think it is about tax haven status, as it were. And I think it's maybe linked to 2 things. One is Brexit, which has knackered the UK economy, and trade. It's killed off trade, quite a lot of trade. And the second thing I think is the UK expects probably to lose more of its crown dependencies in future. These offshore tax havens, as they become independent republics, they become they're not crown dependencies anymore. So you can't use them as a tax haven. And the Commission, obviously, that was one of the reasons I think we had Brexit as well. It was about London's love of these offshore tax havens. I think the idea here is a very crude Tory mechanism to try to develop the UK as a tax haven. And that won't be good necessarily for anybody here, because most of the offshore tax interests already exploit Scotland. Scotland is plundered just like any colony. Its energy, its lands, its resources, everything is sucked out at low price and sold back to us high.
Okay, so we've got the government we've got, right, and we know what they're like. So maybe they're after making Britain into a tax haven. But I mean, are there any real genuine advantages to a country to have free ports? I mean, is there a genuine advantage for Singapore?
Yes, I would say so. You've got to remember, Singapore handles, I think, more than 30 million containers a year, handles more trade by value than Britain.
It's in that strategic position as well, isn't it? Between East and
one
West.
Of the projects I was working on here was to develop a container transshipment hub in Orkney.
Yeah.
Which would gather the ships coming transatlantic through the Pentland Firth to the Baltic and to Hamburg and so on, as they go across the Atlantic to Canada, to the US, to the Caribbean and South America and so on. And we had a lot of interest from companies that would have liked to use Orkney as a distribution centre for the Baltic states, for others. You could see this in things like seafood, in foods and drinks, and so whiskey, obviously, Guinness even. There was quite a lot of cargoes and car parts and other things that you could store here and add value to and then re-export for other markets. Orkney's a small economy. Orkney couldn't sustain a container hub on its own. It has to be for transshipment. Yeah. And so therefore, what Highlands and Islands Enterprise were keen on was extending the Freeport idea for Orkney to maybe Caithness, so you could have the Highlands feeding into this with some employment there, especially in things like seafood processing and other goods. And that way you could develop a lot more trade. And as I said, that's what gives Singapore and other countries, like other small places, or even Dubai, enormous trade clout with its value of trade. With Orkney, what I estimated was it would be quite easy with a modest container port and Freeport here to double Scotland's trade by value, just with a small port here.
If you double it by value, do you also double revenue? Is there a revenue benefit to Scottish Government?
Yes, there would be some benefits, but I think the other key thing here is it puts Scotland on the global map to some extent. It makes inward investment a bit easier if you've got global connectivity on your doorstep. It brings in a lot of interest from outside interests that can develop commercial activities in that host economy.
Would they be paying tax to Westminster or Holyrood, though? Who's benefiting?
Well, it depends if we're independent. The blockage to the container port idea in Orkney was from the UK government. From the council, we had the Harbours Department. We're working on this for a couple of years and developed a project, got the project through almost through planning and everything. Also attracted an investor to operate the terminal. Wow. So we had moved ahead that far, and I actually had prepared the European application for funding, because this port project would also have benefited Europe. Yeah. And it was part of the trans-European networks. What we calculated, it would save a large amount in emissions, ship emissions, because transshipment here was going to reduce emissions overall and reduce pressure on the congested hubs, Rotterdam, Hamburg. These ports were full and they couldn't handle anymore. Plus we had the natural deep water in Orkney, so we had no need to dredge for the biggest ships to come in here. No dredging, whereas all these river ports in Rotterdam, Hamburg, so Antwerp, they're all shallow. London, they're all extremely shallow. They've got dredging vessels permanently stationed there, and this is costing billions just to dredge rivers.
So is this another one on the shelf for when we're independent?
Yeah, so there was a whole range of additional benefits of Orkney. It wasn't just about money. It was about environment and about improving competitiveness, overcoming the bottlenecks, overcoming all the congestion costs of shipping and all the extra pollution you get from ships queuing up outside Hamburg and Rotterdam and London. Yeah. So you've got queues of ships outside there that wait on a berth, because the berths are difficult to get. So this was about alleviating the pressure on the hubs. It was a whole range of issues, but it would have put Scotland on the global map. It would have culturally been an enormous benefit, I think, to give us that connectivity again that we don't have. We're out of the game internationally.
Did London actually come up with a reason apart from being bloody minded. But
what London was doing was pushing all the emphasis on container ports in the south of England, not in Scotland. That's where they wanted development.
This concept of the green port then for Scotland, it's not a container port because you've just explained that. So what is the green element of it and who benefits from that?
Yeah, it's just a soundbite, a label. And I think it's only there because these ports, the Forth and Cromarty, will support the installation of the offshore wind farms. And that's what they're about. They're not about creating trade. They're about actually exporting trade value cheap. So the big beneficiaries, apart from the ports, are going to be the international energy companies that are fleecing Scotland anyway.
So it's actually something that's going to lose us.
Yeah, we get no benefit from this whatsoever. It's renewable energy that's already being stripped out of Scotland, plundered, and that's the reality. We get no benefit. It won't create trade as such. You're only going to be importing more jackets for the turbines and more turbines. And once that's finished, all these ports are going to do is service the wind farms.
Scotland's now going to be host to 2 new green free ports, one of which is in Cromarty, one of which is in Forth. These free ports are not just a couple of warehouses down by the harbour side. They cover zones up to 45 kilometres away from that harbour, which means that places as far away from Edinburgh as Biggar and Carluke and Motherwell are now within the fourth Freeport zone. And any company in these zones who wants a tax break can sign up to its conditions. That's no way to run an economy, no way to run international trade. Freeports don't work, they never have.
She's saying Freeports simply a means for UK government to retain a foothold in Scotland. The investment is minuscule, 26 million over 2 years for each Greenport, small potatoes.
I'd say less a foothold and more an influence. They're certainly stamping their mark down because the entire purpose of Freeport is to lift government control away. There are enclaves where you're not checking the taxes, you're not checking the regulations. You're explicitly saying regulations will be reduced, possibly reducing the means by which you're checking to see if they're complying with the regulations that remain.
So they all said they were terrible, didn't they? Am I right? Am I right?
Yeah, pretty much.
For pirates and tax evaders.
Pirates and tax evaders do seem to be the main beneficiaries, which does beg the question, well, maybe it answers the question, why do Tories like them so much?
Oh, yeah. We may be being a bit unfair on Tories, actually. That's no, we're not.
But it is interesting because the UK has had them before, introduced by Margaret Thatcher in 1984. And they were abandoned by Cameron in 2012 because they didn't work. They weren't adding anything to trade.
I didn't even know that we had Freeport. I mean, I was alive during all that time, and it's a long time before Cameron decided to get rid of them, isn't it?
And then it's only 10 years, well, 11 years now, since they were abandoned. So why are we bringing them back again? And it does seem to be that Truss was very much in favour of them, although we know what happened to her plans, but so soon.
Oh, but no, that's not fair. Now, Liz Truss had some very keen economic ideas, didn't she?
She did.
And they all went.
Just not for this planet. But so what's quite interesting, if you've got something that's basically a Tory project that's been brought in, abandoned and then resurrected by the Tories, why is the SNP cooperating, is my question. Well, there was some discussion at the SNP's 2021 conference where they came up with 6 tests they wanted before they would support the proposal. All businesses operating within the Freeport area must pay the real living wage and abide by fair work practices. Trade union recognition is mandatory. There must be sufficient financial investment into local government to allow them to carry out required services within Freeport zones. Seems reasonable. All businesses must work in alignment with achieving the Scottish Government's net zero targets. Local businesses must be fully compensated if they are negatively affected by Freeport operation. That's an interesting one. And all relevant health and safety, environmental and legal enforcement controls, etc., provided by the relevant agencies must be in place.
That all sounds highly laudable, doesn't it?
Perfectly reasonable. And actually, in the debate that the government has been having at Holyrood, most of those are coming up.
So that's the first time I've seen that list of 6 requirements. Is that going to make the 2 now agreed Scottish free ports, will that make them significantly different from the ones in the rest of the UK? Do we know that?
The implication is that they do make them different, because John Swinney, when he was doing his ministerial statement about which 2 had been chosen, on addressing the concerns that he knows people have raised about free ports. And I think in that he does say that they've negotiated a distinctively Scottish approach.
So this term green free port, that's a term that the Scottish government is using to describe free ports under those 6 requirements. Okay.
That's right. Whether that's genuinely different or greenwashing we'll come on to, but at the moment that is the distinction they make. What we're going to play now is the way that Holyrood has tried to implement those 6 tests, I guess. So we've got a little clip from back in February 22, Ivan McKee explaining how the process was going to work to do the selection. And then we've got John Swinney addressing concerns that he knows people have raised. But then we have Ross Greer, and this is one area that is excluded from the Bute House Agreement.
That's the Bute House Agreement between the SNP and the Scottish Green Party.
Yeah. So this is an area that's excluded from that. And if you listen to Ross Greer's view, you can see why their views are just miles apart.
To ask the Scottish Government how it will apply fair work and net zero criteria to the Freeport developments with the UK Government.
Minister Ivan McG.
Fair work and net zero are central to our ambition for Scotland's Greenports. We will apply fair work and net zero criteria at 3 stages of the process. Currently, we are finalising the prospectus for applicants and will ensure that is clear about the Scottish Government's expectations in respect of fair work and net zero. We will scrutinise all bids for evidence of a commitment to embedding fair work practices, including payment of the real living wage and pursuing robust decarbonisation plans. And following designation, strict governance and rigorous monitoring and evaluation will ensure ongoing compliance on these key priorities and across a whole range of other aspects where we are very sure and determined that successful Greenport bids will comply to all required regulation, including, as I say, payment of the real living wage, delivering on the net zero aspirations and supporting fair work practices. Applications which do not meet these high standards will not succeed.
Julie Mackay.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Could the Minister confirm that if companies were not to provide the living wage or not to recognise trade unions, for example, that they would be ineligible for support?
Minister.
We see this as a real opportunity to move forward our conditionality agenda, and the member will know, because this is part of the Bute House Agreement with the Greens, that we intend and are very keen on something I'm very committed to, rolling out conditionality on fair work and real living wage to as many businesses as possible across Scotland in terms of the support we provide, and Greenports are no exception. Scottish Government is very clear that fair work and payment of the real living wage is a requirement for us supporting any businesses within Greenport designated areas.
Finally, Presiding Officer, I want to acknowledge and address some of the concerns that have previously been expressed by members about free ports more generally. As my ministerial colleagues and I have said before in this chamber, we are well aware of the mixed views and reputation of some free ports elsewhere in the world. We understand the critical importance of protecting workers' conditions and rights. We understand worries about potential displacement of economic activity from elsewhere, and we understand concerns about deregulation and potential illicit activity. So we have sought to address them in the approach we have negotiated with the United Kingdom Government. First, we required bidders to commit to the principles of fair work, including payment of the real living wage and effective workers' voice, and to outline how they propose to embed them across the green free ports. Both of the winning bidders offered firm commitments on this. We will pursue those commitments with them in more detail as we move from initial decisions to the business case phase and onwards to funding and delivery, and we will hold them to their commitments as we monitor progress on the ground. Second, we will require the successful bidders to develop and report on their plans to monitor, mitigate and report on any potential displacement of economic activity. And finally, The Green Freeports will be required to adhere to the OECD Code of Conduct for Clean Free Trade Zones, to comply with tough UK regulations preventing money laundering, and to establish and share with enforcement agencies a register of all businesses operating within the tax sites. The operators of any customs sites will require prior authorisations by His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And all of the activities of the Green Freeports will be subject to close monitoring and evaluation. So I am confident that the significant economic potential of the two Green Freeports will be accompanied by high standards of governance, transparency and enforcement.
Thank you. There is nothing green about Freeports. There are many tax havens. The EU found that they attracted money laundering, smuggling and other criminal activities. And the last time the UK tried them, only increased regional inequality. And whilst there are lots of warm words about fair work and net zero, I can't yet see any hard legal requirements binding these Freeports to the grand promises that they've made. I acknowledge that the Government has tried to address the concerns that the Scottish Greens hold, but can I ask, will the Scottish Government act to remove Freeport status from either operator if it breaks the commitments it's made on workers' rights and environmental protection?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, the Government will act in that fashion. So we are serious about the points that have been advanced. Obviously, I will try hard over the period ahead to persuade Mr Greer of the merits of the steps that we are taking, but I do assure him that we will act to protect the commitments that have been built into the Green Freeport concept.
They're clearly not all in agreement. So we've heard from several different voices already and very, very different views. There's some peculiarities that are starting to emerge as people turn their attention to Freeports that are not included in those 6 tests, and I haven't heard mentioned at all yet by any of the ministers involved. So the first one of those is a really interesting one. You know, all the fuss that we hear about, how could we have an independent Scotland? It would put a border between England and Scotland. Well, it turns out that Freeports are essentially small custom zones. So 10 Freeports is 10 additional internal customs borders within the UK. Okay.
The idea of a Freeport is you create this zone where you can import components, turn them into goods and then export them without paying the import tariffs or any export tariffs. But if the good leaves the Freeport and comes into your domestic economy, then it has to pay the tariffs. So you create a customs border around the Freeport. Now, a traditional Freeport would be a chained off zone in the harbour or at the airport where you did all this kind of thing. But in the UK's Freeport model, you have this vast zone and companies in the Freeport zone can be located within, anywhere within it. So you could have, hypothetically, components coming into Rosyth and being trucked to Biggar to be turned into something and then trucked back to Rosyth to be exported. Don't know what kind of goods you would want to do that with. But how do you then say, right, well, we've made the thing and made the widget in Biggar. Can we not just send it over to Hamilton instead? Nobody's really watching, are they? You end up with this very complex, very porous customs border that is absolutely impossible to regulate. So there's the potential of vast amount of tax fraud and regulation fraud happening out of that. Yes, it does paint the people who are saying putting up a border in because of independence as a terrible thing, as at least somewhat hypocritical if they're then carving out micro chunks of the UK and turning each one of those warehouses into its own customs border. We will just have to see how these Freeports actually work out, because even the regulations that cover them are still extremely vague.
We know that the amount of fuss that's created by the idea of one border between England and Scotland. Freeports seem to be creating multiple customs borders actually in the country. And I was interested when you mentioned the EU there, because it had crossed my mind, is this a way of sneaking back into the EU by shrinking the border inland? How is that going to work when there's trade borders within the country, or does it not matter? Will they be policed at all?
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. When I first went into shipping, it was 1974, and it was the year after we entered the European Union. And the transit forms that we had for cargo going from, I was dealing with container ships going from Leith to Denmark and to Holland and so on. And the transit documentation, everything was very, very simple. It was simplified. So it just eased the flow of trade to some extent. So we're now out of that game. So trade becomes more problematic. Trade becomes more difficult. The other problem we had going back then is we didn't invest in port infrastructure. So we lost all that. Shipping activity was lost from the 70s on. And then you just had constant recessions anyway as part of the UK model. Scotland's economy just really was continually collapsing. And I think the problem we've had in the last 20 years is zero growth, pretty much zero growth. Our trade is potentially really good, but we don't get the real value of it. We don't get the value of the oil, the gas, the electricity. We don't get the value of the whiskey, really. We don't get the value of the grouse estates. We don't get the value of all the infrastructure. All our assets have been sold off, all our utilities, the ports, the airports, energy companies. Scotland is just an economic, it's like an underdeveloped colony. That's what it's been left at, assets stripped, plundered. And that's why half the people live in or close to poverty, because we don't have access to our resources. Colonial reality, the imperial power just plunders.
That's complicated,
isn't it? And it gets even more complicated when you think, well, how do you know what the border of a free port is? And there's a few other details as well that are coming to light. Now, these were discussed in Craig's Commonweal Policy Podcast. He had Richard Murphy on as a guest, and would definitely recommend you listen to that whole episode. It's very good. We'll link to it in the notes. But I've just captured about 4 minutes of the discussion, what some of those other conditions are.
The evidence is incredibly strong that free ports do not create new jobs. What we will see is that Forth and Cromarty, up and running as free ports, we may well see some jobs move from elsewhere in Scotland into those free ports. Will there be any net new jobs as a result? The evidence for that is very low. We will see an increase in the complication of regulation. I know that. I'm a chartered accountant, and I look at tax regulation, and there are whole new tables of tax data that now exist inside our tax system to manage the taxes due by employees working in free ports, because they have different rates of national insurance. We are offering lower rates of tax to employers in particular who are employing people inside free ports. These things are not simple geographic areas drawn around a port. Yeah, you can't just say, oh, there's the port, and we'll say that the boundary of the port is where the free port ends. Free ports can actually cover a very large geographic area. And they can be little isolated warehouses spread right across that whole geographic area. Now, that's significant, because if we can't identify where the borders are, and yet taxes change on that border, how do we know we can stop abuse within the border and outside the border? And how do we know that an employer is correctly saying, oh, I'm employing this person within the free port, when actually they could be employing them outside the free port? And what do you do about the person who drives the truck that moves the items into the free port and then out again? Are they employed in the free port, or are they employed outside the free port? People might have noticed the furore about the dredging that is going on around the free port, again in the northeast of England, where very large numbers of shellfish and other types of fish appear to be being, well, literally killed by the process of dredging, where toxic chemicals are being released.
Once the central locus has been decided for these free ports, companies, I think, up to 45 kilometres away from that locus can apply to be part of the free port. What's your understanding about the green bit?
Greenwashing, I think, is the only thing we can honestly say. What can be green about making products which increase consumption inside a location where it is deliberately designed that the return to capital will be higher, the return to labour will be lower, and the environment will be abused to achieve this outcome? I don't see how that can ever be considered to be green.
One of the things that they're touting these green free ports for is the construction of renewable energy, so wind turbines. But if the idea of a Freeport is it allows you to import components, build things, and then export the final goods without having to bother about tax and regulation, then the corollary of that is exporting wind turbines might be a good thing for Scotland, but it also means that you can't use those wind turbines in Scotland without having to then negotiate bringing the goods into the real economy. So is it really benefiting Scottish renewable sector to be building wind turbines that you're not allowed to use in Scotland?
Somebody's got to make up the taxes that aren't paid. And actually, some of those taxes that aren't going to be paid are actually local authority taxes, because there are also reduced business taxes, council equivalents of business taxes. And who's going to make good those? Who's making good the loss of revenues potentially to the Scottish Government?
Complicated, isn't it?
It is, and I didn't think the 6 questions fitted those very well at all, because it's talking about making up damage that local businesses around the Freeport might suffer because trade is happening inside the Freeport that they would otherwise have, presumably. But it's not talking about taxes and local rates and things and business taxes. That's not included in those 6 points. It's not even mentioned in the 6 points.
Does it not follow from those 6 points that if it's going to be put into place, then the Scottish Government will be following up on that, or am I just being naive?
Well, I mean, it should be, but I didn't hear it mentioned in any of the discussion that John Swinney had or that Ivan McGee had. They talk about fair wages, which is fine. They talk about environmental controls, but they didn't talk about things like, just the day-to-day complexities of how do you know what tax rate somebody should be paying? And when you think about that 45-kilometre border round Forthports, I'm in that. It could be that one of the businesses in my local high street might decide to apply to be part of the Freeport. So they'd be paying a different rate of tax to everybody else in the street.
If you've got one guy in your high street and he's part of the Freeport, the other guys in your high street are losing out. But maybe only because he's paying less business tax or something. So you'd think that would be covered by those 6 points, but it would be terribly complicated. Maybe, in the process of setting it up, it will be much more of a tighter enclave than that.
But if it can include individual warehouses, though, essentially you've got a customs border around each one of those warehouses.
Yeah,
so you might have one sitting in Livingston, Biggar was the other example, Motherwell, all these places. And the idea that goods come in, get something added to them and go out again, and they're treated as if they've not come into the country. Who's check-in to make sure that they're not? Because all those little boundaries are going to be porous.
There are bonded warehouses all over the country with barrels of whiskey in them, aren't there? They must have some sort of experience of dealing with it, but it's going to need a lot of thought to get it right, and presumably more people to apply it.
And the other thing that struck me is that lower tax and lower NI, because they're benefits to the businesses. Now, who's one of the biggest businesses that's going to benefit from that? BP. What's one company that is rolling in money right now because of the cost of living and fuel? BP. But they're going to be putting their hydrogen stuff, I think, in the northeast of England, Teesside, around there. That's going to become a big BP centre. Now,
but is that going to be within a Freeport?
Yeah. So BP is going to be paying less tax and lower rates of NI. People who work for BP are going to be paying less tax and lower rates of NI. So people might go and live in those places, which is, probably somewhere like Teesside. It's probably good. Teesside lost a huge amount of workforce when all the industry was taken away. Yeah. But Forthports, dragging people into the Edinburgh area, really.
So those people go there for those jobs, but they're not living. No. They're not. Their schools and their swimming pools and their sewage are not all taken care of within that Freeport. They're taken care of by the local authority, aren't they?
Yeah.
But that local authority is not getting the income from that tax.
And we haven't seen regulations, so we don't know exactly how they're going to work. It seems to be a lot more complicated than anything we're hearing from our government even just now.
It wasn't as complicated as that a few thousand years back, was it, when Orkney was the centre of all that trade that went by?
The trading world.
It's kind of got so complicated these days.
So far, we've still got a lot of unanswered questions, and we've still got differences of views as to whether they're good or not. Bids came in from various projects around Scotland, including Greenock. There was bids from Aberdeen. There was bids from Orkney. So we wondered how our Orkney guests were feeling about the fact they weren't successful in the bid. Are you guys happy that the Green Freeport bid failed, or do you think it should have succeeded? You just get so many different views about whether these are good things. Yet everybody seems annoyed when they don't get one, but at the same time they hate them.
I'm in two minds, I must say. I'm not sure about the name Greenport, but the idea that a Freeport can generate more jobs and everything is obviously very attractive. But it also attracts a lot of other things that you don't want. And so I really can't say that I have made up my mind on that. I think from what little I've gathered, Freeports generally haven't been a good idea wherever they've been set up. They do give a boost in the short term, but in the long term, they just add a lot of problems. And mainly because there is no control over what happens inside them.
Yeah.
That it becomes it's like something of Pirates of the Caribbean, where there's no regulation. They get round tax, having to pay tax, and they don't have to follow health and safety legislation, and they don't even have to answer any questions just about what they're doing there. So I would be very wary of it. I believe that regulation is necessary when it's something that's not in the interests of the shareholder. That means things like health and safety and pollution and so on. And that a Freeport is asking for trouble. And to call them Greenports is just, to my mind, greenwashing. And that the thought that you can tie the Freeport in with some sort of green efforts or projects would happen up until the point that they won the contract, and then it would disappear.
And again, I go back to Orkney, who recently missed out on having a green port. They have very ambitious harbour redevelopment plans for renewable production. These plans need to be realised in order that Scotland meets its climate targets. And I would welcome reassurance on this point that they will be assisted to develop those harbours.
Obviously, I empathise with the bids that have been unsuccessful. The Minister for Business will be in Orkney on tomorrow and Friday to sign the Islands Growth Deal, so obviously Orkney will be benefiting from that. And there's some elements of the proposal emerging from Orkney around about Scapa Flow, which I think contains some interesting possibilities for further development, and we will, of course, continue dialogue with Orkney Islands Council in that respect.
Flotta, you asked about Flotta. Flotta is planned to become a hydrogen generating station using electricity coming from west of Orkney. And so that would then, it's a port already, handling tankers, so they can generate the hydrogen and put it onto tankers and ship it around the world.
Who runs Flotta at the moment?
The Chinese. It's a nationalised thing. It belongs to the Chinese government, basically. I believe.
Really?
Well, I think it's the Chinese. I think they've maybe got two big oil companies. There's one of them that bought Flotta off Talisman that had it last.
Yeah.
Do you know, this is like, we were just talking to Alf the other day about, because Forthports, one of the successful bidders for the Greenports, they're owned by Canadian teachers, pension funds and various offshore financial. We own nothing.
Absolutely. And Freeports are just, well, greenwash, as Mike says, is being very kind.
I was just grinning to myself when you said owned by the Chinese, because I don't know if either of you two are fans of Borgen, the Danish political based one, and there was a new series recently, and the whole thing is about Greenland and the relationship with Denmark. But Greenland had been, they've got this fantastic offer, but the offer comes from a Chinese company to take over a port and then develop it. So when you said that, I thought, oh my God, we're going to have that Borgen kind of script writing, but it'll all be happening in Scapa Flow and Flock.
One of the first things we have to do with independence is basically nationalise Forth Ports and Clyde-Port.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we've got no major harbours.
That was one of the first things that Estonia did on independence. These guys have to go,
and Freeports have to go with them. Hopefully, they'll never get them established.
Yes, that's fingers crossed that's true, actually, because it's easier to stop something kind of just in the planning stage than it is if it actually had, if independence takes longer than I would like, but and they're actually there and running. That's a bit more difficult to stop.
I've got a quick look at some of the projects that are on the go with this Orkney Renewable Energy Forum. They've got a YouTube channel, so if you search for OREF, Orkney Renewable Energy Forum, you'll see videoed versions of their meetings. And there was a very, very interesting one about the renewable future and possibilities for Orkney, including Scapa Flow. It's a 2-hour meeting, so I've distilled 6 minutes of highlights. Obviously, if you want to know more information about that, go and watch the meeting. It's very interesting. It's just way too long for us to get into this programme. I'll link to the main meeting in the notes.
Huge natural harbour that could hopefully be used in some of the ways that Alf and Mike and Geordie were talking about.
Yeah, huge potential. They're not saying we can only do this if we get a Freeport bid. They're saying this is what we're going to do, and I think it's really exciting seeing the drive that they've got. So do you feel you know a bit more about Freeports now?
Well, yes, I do. Undoubtedly, I know more, because that's not a high bar to have passed, because I didn't know anything. But I do know more. But I think I just appreciate that the complexity of it. I mean, I do genuinely appreciate that the Scottish Government has, tried hard to work out ways and to make them, as acceptable as possible. But I'm not sure that they're going to be able to do it, because it is so complicated. But it's certainly going to be something to keep an eye on as we, the next sort of couple of years as these 2 new Freeports get underway.
Absolutely. And, it might be that they're a short-lived thing.
Yeah, it might.
Certainly last time they didn't last that long. Lots of different views. We probably will come back to this at some point as things develop a bit more, actually, as you say, Marlene.
I found a few articles by various people. It's just more information about the background to Freeports and the Scottish Government approach to it. So I'm going to put those on the blog if people want to have a look at that.
Oh, we do regularly mention our blog, so hopefully everybody knows we do have one and where to find it. And if you sign up to our mailing list, you'll get links sent out to you every month as well of what's on the blog. So little plug for that. Okay, that's it for this month. Don't forget, we've got a podcast every Friday, and we'll catch you later.
Yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.